In this video, you are going to hear the most detailed story you may ever hear about one of the most dangerous, volatile, and influential gangsters America ever produced, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. You will hear how a poor immigrant kid from the filthy tenements of Brooklyn turned himself into a street extortionist, then into a prohibition enforcer, then into one of the founding killers of the modern American Mafia. You will hear how he helped build the national crime syndicate, how he used shootings, bombings, and beatings to force small shopkeepers, gambling operators, and bookmakers to pay, how he was tied to some of the most important gangland murders of the 1930s, how he pushed into Hollywood and Los Angeles and built criminal rackets behind the glamour of the movie industry, how he tangled with narcotics, race wire control, and offshore gambling ships, how he stole millions from his own partners while building a desert casino, and how that betrayal ended when a rifle muzzle appeared outside a quiet Beverly Hills window and bullets smashed through the glass. This is not just a list of crimes. We are going to walk through them step by step, from the frightened shopkeepers paying protection in the streets of New York to the last moment when Benjamin Siegel leaned back on a sofa with a newspaper in his hands and never got the chance to look up. If you like long, documentary-style true crime stories that go far beyond the legend and show exactly what people did, how they operated, and what it cost, make sure you subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay with us to the very end. In the description under this video, you'll also find a link to our Telegram channel, where we post extra photos, newspaper clippings, and documents that YouTube doesn't allow to show. Subscribe, check out the Telegram, and now, let's go all the way back to the beginning of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Benjamin Siegel was born on February 28, 1906, in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, into a world where the American dream and harsh reality collided at every corner. His parents, Max and Jenny, were Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe who had fled pogroms and grinding poverty with nothing more than the hope that America would be different. What they found instead was a cramped tenement in a neighborhood crowded with other desperate families, each trying to claw its way out of hunger and anonymity. The air in the streets smelled of coal smoke, garbage, and sweat. Children ran in packs between horse carts and early automobiles. Adults argued in Yiddish, Italian, English, and a dozen other tongues. The walls of the Siegel apartment were thin arguments, babies crying, neighbors fighting, and furniture being moved echoed through the rooms at all hours. It was not a world designed for calm, patient ambition. Benjamin was a small, wiry boy with sharp dark eyes and a restless energy that rarely allowed him to sit still. He watched his father struggle to make a living as a pushcart peddler, selling odds and ends in the street, often returning home exhausted with just enough money for rent and a little food. He watched his mother worry over bills, stretch meals, patch clothes, and pray that the landlord would wait one more week. The lesson was clear. Honesty and hard work did not guarantee anything. They might keep you barely alive, but they did not give you respect. And respect, in that environment, meant almost as much as food. School never had much of a hold on him. He went because the law said he had to, because his parents insisted, because that is what children did. But the cramped classrooms, the strict teachers, and the feeling of being looked down on by more established Americans bored and offended him. Outside, in the streets and alleys, there was action and opportunity. There, strength and nerve mattered more than grammar. There, a boy could invent himself. It did not take long for Benjamin to gravitate toward that world. As a teenager, he became involved in the simplest and oldest racket of the city streets: protection. In the crowded Jewish and Italian districts of Brooklyn and the Lower East Side, hundreds of small vendors struggled to make a living. Fruit sellers, vegetable peddlers, small shopkeepers, pushcart owners. They had no security guards, no corporate backing, no political connections. They were vulnerable, and in a world where the police often ignored the problems of poor immigrants, they were on their own. Young toughs like Siegel saw this as a business opportunity. The pattern was basic but brutally effective. 2 or 3 boys would approach a vendor and explain that this was a dangerous neighborhood. Fires happened, windows were broken, stock went missing. But for a small weekly payment of few dollars, maybe less, these problems could be avoided. The message was clear without needing to be spoken aloud. Pay, and we will protect you from people like us. Refuse, and we will show you exactly how weak you are. Money that should have gone to rent, food, or reinvestment in the business started flowing into the pockets of street enforcers like Benjamin. It was during this period that Siegel met a boy who would shape the rest of his life: Meyer Lansky. Lansky was small and quiet, where Siegel was impulsive and loud. He had a mathematical mind and a calm, almost cold way of thinking through problems. He did not look dangerous in the way Siegel did. He looked like a schoolboy who had read too many books. But under that exterior was a fierce intelligence and an absolute clarity about what he wanted. Money, power, and a way out of the grinding poverty of his childhood. The two boys formed a partnership built on complementary strengths. Siegel brought fearless aggression and a willingness to shoot. Lansky brought planning, calculation, and a knack for spotting where the real profits lay. The little gang they assembled around themselves soon became known informally as the Bugs and Maya Mob. The name Bugs was a reference to Siegel's reputation for being bughouse crazy when he lost his temper. Other kids had seen it. One moment he could be joking and laughing, the next his face could harden, his eyes could go flat and cold, and his fists or his gun would follow. He reportedly hated the nickname Bugsy because it made him sound like a lunatic, something out of control. He preferred to see himself as deliberate, a man who chose violence, not a man controlled by it. But the underworld and the press did not care about his self-image. The name stuck. In the early 1920s, as prohibition took effect and the manufacture and sale of alcohol became illegal, the underworld underwent a transformation. Overnight, something that ordinary people had consumed in bars and restaurants became contraband, and the profits associated with it moved from legitimate businesses to criminals. For Siegel and Lansky, who already had a base of operations in the street rackets, this was an opening into a far bigger game. Suddenly, men who had once made a few dollars a week from extorting pushcart owners could make hundreds, then thousands, transporting liquor, guarding warehouses, collecting from speakeasies and punishing anyone who tried to sell without permission. The Bugs and Maya crew adapted quickly. They took on work as enforcers for larger bootlegging organizations, guarding trucks loaded with whiskey and beer, standing watch at clandestine breweries, and dealing with hijackers. Hijacking the robbery of rival gang shipments became a specialty of many crews, and Siegel was reportedly fearless in this fear. Ambushing a convoy on a dark road, guns drawn, engines running, meant accepting the possibility that the men in the other trucks were just as willing to shoot and just as desperate. But the payoff an entire truckload of illegal liquor could be huge. Siegel's readiness to pull the trigger became known as far beyond his own neighborhood. Stories circulated of him shooting without hesitation, sometimes over money, sometimes over perceived disrespect, sometimes just to send a message. Violence, for him, was not a last resort, it was part of the toolkit, as natural as speaking or shaking a hand. Yet he could also be charming. This combination, the ability to talk smoothly in one moment and explode the next, made him both particularly frightening and particularly useful to men higher up the underworld ladder. One of those men was Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano, an Italian immigrant who had risen to prominence in New York's Italian Mafia, had a vision for reorganizing American organized crime. He wanted to move away from the old-style system of bosses who ruled their own families like feudal lords and towards something more modern, structured and profit-driven. A national syndicate that would unite Italian, Jewish, and other gangs in a loose but powerful alliance. To get there, he had to win a bloody internal war, the Castellamarese War, against rival boss Joe Masria, and later eliminate even his own ostensible ally, Salvatore Maranzano, who was too wedded to old customs and too suspicious of change. Historians still argue about the exact composition of the hit teams that carried out these pivotal murders, but Benjamin Siegel's name appears again and again in accounts of those days. Many sources place him among the gunmen who killed Joe Masria in a Coney Island restaurant in 1931, an execution that saw Luciano leave the room under the pretext of using the bathroom moments before shooters walked in and opened fire. Later that same year, when Luciano decided that Maranzano had to go, the killing was carried out by a team that, according to some testimonies and later reconstructions, included Jewish gangsters disguised as federal agents. They entered Maranzano's office, flashed fake badges, disarmed his guards, and then stabbed and shot him to death. Benjamin Siegel has been named as one of those disguised assassins. Whether every detail of those stories is perfectly accurate or not, what matters for our purposes is that in the underworld consciousness of the time, Siegel was seen as a man who did high-level killing for the most powerful gangster in New York. Those murders reshaped the map of American organized crime. With Masria and Maranzano gone, Luciano and his allies were able to establish what came to be known as the Commission, a kind of board of directors for the Mafia, and, alongside Jewish partners like Lansky, create the National Crime Syndicate. This syndicate coordinated gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering, extortion, and other illegal business across city and state lines. To enforce its decisions and protect its interests, it needed muscle that was not tied to one neighborhood or one ethnic group. That muscle came from a loosely organized group of killers based largely in Brooklyn. Murder, Inc. The press coined the name Murder, Inc. Later, but the concept existed from the beginning. If a local boss had a problem he could not solve through negotiation, a rival who would not listen, a thief who kept taking from the wrong pockets, a potential informant talking too much, he could send word up the chain. The syndicate would dispatch a team of killers, often Jewish or Italian, who would travel to the target city under false names, carry out the job with professional care, and disappear. Pay was good. Loyalty was enforced by both cash and fear. The work required men who were not only willing to kill but able to do it calmly, without leaving a trail. Benjamin Siegel's earlier record made him a natural part of this network. In this role, Siegel's crimes became more complex and more serious. No longer was he just shaking down card owners or beating up small-time rivals. Now he was involved in carefully planned assassinations designed to shape the strategic direction of the entire underworld. This meant tracking targets, studying their movements, learning where they ate, where they slept, who they trusted, and finding the moment when they were exposed. It might mean entering a building dressed as a policeman or a mailman, approaching a car on a dark street, or waiting outside an apartment door with a gun wrapped in newspaper. Many of those killings never made the front page. They were logged in police files as gangland slayings, with the usual formula. Victim found with multiple bullet wounds, no witnesses, no usable evidence. But each one sent a message through the criminal world. If you crossed the syndicate, men like Siegel would come for you. But as his importance grew, so did the attention of law enforcement. The more murders piled up, the more ambitious prosecutors and crusading journalists wanted heads to roll. During the 1930s, investigations into Murder Inc. and the National Crime Syndicate intensified. Informants began to talk, sometimes under fear, sometimes in exchange for reduced sentences. Names surfaced. Among those names, again and again, was Bugsy Siegel. Police in multiple cities had files on him. Suspected in the shooting, questioned in that bombing, linked by rumor and half-proven reports to another disappearance. Yet for all this, he remained at liberty. Witnesses vanished or recanted, juries were intimidated, evidence went missing. The lesson Siegel drew from this, that he was effectively bulletproof in the legal sense, would contribute to the recklessness that marked his later years. While all this was happening, America itself was changing. The Great Depression and then the lead-up to the Second World War shifted priorities and stretched law enforcement resources. At the same time, new opportunities arose for organized crime. One of the most lucrative was the movie industry and the booming metropolis that housed it. Los Angeles. Hollywood was full of money, ego, and vice. Actors, producers, and studio heads needed discreet services. Gambling, women, drugs, debt collection, quiet protection from stalkers or extortionists. At the same time, Hollywood itself could be extorted or subtly controlled. Unions, studio supplies, construction contracts, nightclub licenses all could be influenced, bought, or threatened. For a man like Benjamin Siegel, who liked nice suits, expensive restaurants, and rubbing shoulders with glamorous people, the move from the smoky bars of New York to the sunny boulevards of Los Angeles was more than just a strategic relocation. It was a lifestyle upgrade. Somewhere in the mid-1930s, with the blessing of the syndicate and the quiet planning of Meyer Lansky, Siegel shifted his center of operations to California. On paper, he was now a businessman. In reality, he was the East Coast Syndicate's representative on the West Coast, their man in Los Angeles, responsible for extending and guarding their reach into everything that could make money in that part of the country. His list of crimes began to include more white-collar elements, layered on top of the violence. He would be involved in rigging union votes, muscle behind labor disputes, the silent partner in nightclubs and casinos, the unseen hand in bookmaking and horse race betting. One of the key rackets he helped oversee was control of the race wire service. Before television, before widespread radio coverage of every race, bookmakers across America relied on telegraph wires to get race results quickly. Whoever controlled those wires could choke off a bookmaker's ability to operate or feed him selective information. The syndicate understood the power of information and moved to dominate those wire services. In California, Siegel used intimidation and sometimes outright violence to bring independent operators into line. A bookmaker who tried to use an alternative wire service might find his office vandalized, his car bombed, or his employees beaten. In extreme cases, he might simply disappear. At the same time, Siegel's name began appearing in investigations of offshore gambling ships anchored beyond the 3-mile limit off the California coast. These ships offered casino games in a limbo zone, claiming they were outside state jurisdiction. They attracted wealthy gamblers and curious thrill seekers. Of course, they also attracted the attention of organized crime. Siegel and his associates provided protection, which in practice meant that ship owners paid them a cut of profits in exchange for help in dealing with law enforcement pressure, union threats, and rival criminals. The protection was offered with the same message that had once been delivered to pushcart owners. Pay, and the trouble goes away. Don't pay, and trouble will come. The crimes in this phase of his life were often less spectacular than the street shootouts of his youth, but far more profitable. Extortion payments from Hollywood nightclubs and racetracks, slices of profits from illegal casinos and bookmaking operations, quiet deals with corrupt politicians and police officers, these added up to a fortune. Meanwhile, the threat of violence always lurked in the background. People who doubted that Siegel still had the will to pull a trigger could check the morgue records, if they knew which names to look for. Even during this time, in the later 1930s and early 1940s, accusations of involvement in narcotics followed him. Heroin and other drugs were flowing into the United States through ports and secret routes. While not every gangster wanted to touch narcotics, the profits were high, but so were the legal risks. The ones who did could not ignore the syndicate structure. Siegel's position as an enforcer and organizer on the West Coast made it almost inevitable that smuggling operations intersected his world. Law enforcement reports and underworld gossip linked his name to shipments, to meetings, to protection applied to traffickers. Even without a conviction, the association between Bugsy Siegel and drug dealing became another entry in the long list of suspected crimes attached to his name. Yet for all that darkness, the image he projected to the public was often dazzling. In Los Angeles, he cultivated friendships with movie stars, producers, and directors. He spent evenings at the Clover Club, the Trocadero, and other glamorous spots along the Sunset Strip. He dated actresses, charmed journalists, and let the town see only what he wanted it to see. A sharp-dressed man with money to spend and interesting stories to tell. Many who met him in those settings found him magnetic. He was funny when he wanted to be, generous with tips and favors, and quick to show a protective side, promising to take care of problems for new friends. For them, his crimes were rumors, half-believed stories that only made him seem more exciting. Behind the scenes, the reality remained unchanged. Extortion payments, threats, and occasional blunt force reminders that he was not just a colorful character but a dangerous criminal operating in a dangerous world. His crimes were no longer confined to back alleys in Brooklyn, they spread across continents, tied into the syndicate's broader operations. And as he played this double role, charming host in Hollywood, brutal enforcer in the shadows, the seeds were being sown for what would become the biggest and most fateful project of his career. The attempt to reinvent himself again, this time as a visionary builder of a gambling empire in the Nevada desert. That part of the story, the Flamingo, the stolen millions, the suspicion, and the final decision of the men he had once called partners will come later. For now, as we close this first part of the story, you should have in your mind a clear picture of who Benjamin Bugsy Siegel had become by the middle of the 1940s. A man whose criminal record included street extortion, prohibition hijacking, participation in syndicate murders, membership in Murder Inc., large-scale racketeering in gambling and racing, suspected narcotics operations, and the ruthless enforcement of his will on both coasts of America. In the next block, we will follow him into the desert, into the birth of Las Vegas as a gangster's dream, and step by step toward the window in Beverly Hills where his past finally caught up with him. By the time the Second World War was drawing to a close, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel stood at a strange crossroads in his criminal career. On one side lay everything he had already built. His reputation as a killer from the old New York days, his connections to Luciano, Lansky, and the syndicate, his control over pieces of the racing wire, bookmaking networks, offshore gambling, Hollywood extortion, and quiet protection rackets. On the other side lay something that seemed, at least on the surface, almost respectable. The chance to turn legal gambling in Nevada into a glittering, money-printing empire that would blur the line between underworld and upper world so thoroughly that ordinary tourists would never see the difference. He wanted more than just cash. Now he wanted a monument, something that would make his name ring across America, not just in police stations but over champagne glasses and orchestra music. Nevada had legalized gambling back in 1931, but for years the action in Las Vegas had been small-scale and rough around the edges. A few clubs downtown like the El Cortez and the Northern offered card games and slots to traveling salesmen, railroad workers, and soldiers passing through. The town was more a dusty crossroads than a destination. But in the mid-1940s, with war veterans returning home, highways improving, and Americans starting to dream about travel and fun after years of sacrifice, some people began to see a different future in that desert. A strip of modern resorts, each like a small kingdom of light and sound, drawing crowds from Los Angeles, from Texas, from the Midwest, and maybe one day from all over the world. One of the first men to try to turn that idea into reality was not a gangster at all, but a California newspaper publisher and playboy named Billy Wilkerson, owner of The Hollywood Reporter. Wilkerson loved European-style elegance, fine restaurants, good wine, tailored suits. He also had a well-known weakness for gambling and risky investments. In the early 1940s, he quietly began buying land on a stretch of Highway 91 just outside Las Vegas, planning a resort that would be fancier, sleeker, and more modern than the dusty downtown joints. He envisioned a palm-lined, pink and white palace with luxury rooms, a beautiful pool, a high-end restaurant and a casino where the dealers wore tuxedos and the crooners on stage sounded like they came from New York or Paris, not a truck stop. He named the project the Flamingo. But dreaming about a resort and actually building one are very different things. Costs quickly outpaced Wilkerson's resources. He had money from his newspaper and other ventures, but the Flamingo devoured cash. Land grading, concrete, steel, plumbing, wiring, imported furniture, design changes, wages for builders and architects. He gambled heavily, on stocks and at the tables, trying to win his way out of trouble. Instead, he sank deeper. By the mid-1940s, Wilkerson was in serious financial distress, and the skeleton of his dream hotel stood half-finished in the desert heat, a monument to ambition outrunning money. That's when organized crime saw its chance. To the men who sat in back rooms in New York, Chicago, and Miami, the Flamingo was more than just a construction job. It was an opportunity to plant a flag. A casino, in a state where gambling was perfectly legal, could launder illicit money, provide a steady flow of legitimate-looking cash, and create a place where businessmen, politicians, and criminals could meet on equal footing under chandeliers instead of in back alleys. A resort like that could become the financial heart of a new kind of empire, one that wore tuxedos over its brass knuckles. Meyer Lansky, always the strategist, understood this. He was conservative with his own money, but he recognized a sound business model when he saw one. A resort with gambling, rooms, food, and shows could generate revenue in multiple ways. Not only from gambling losses but also from hotel stays, drinks, dining, and entertainment. If you could keep people on the property sleeping in your beds, drinking in your bar, playing at your tables, every hour they spent under your roof was another chance to take $1 from them. He did not necessarily want to run it himself. He preferred the shadows. But he needed someone to be the face of the project, the man on the ground. Benjamin Siegel saw the same opportunity, but through very different eyes. Where Lansky saw profit and structure, Siegel saw glamour and power. Here was his chance to stop being the man other bosses called when they needed a job done and to become a kind of boss himself, a casino king. In Hollywood, he was already half playing that role, the charismatic gangster in immaculate suits, surrounded by actors and showgirls. But in Las Vegas, with a resort of his own, he could embed that image in concrete and neon. The Flamingo could be his kingdom in the desert, a place everyone would associate with his name. Through a combination of pressure and negotiation, mob-backed money began to flow into the Flamingo project. Wilkerson, buried in debt and facing ruin, was gradually pushed out. He sold controlling interest under pressure. The exact balance between voluntary sale and veiled threat is still debated. What's clear is that by 194,546, control of the Flamingo had shifted decisively from Wilkerson to a group of syndicate investors. Siegel positioned himself at the center of that group. He traveled back and forth, spoke to contractors, hired architects, ordered changes and upgrades. And this is where the next phase of his criminal history explodes in detail, because the Flamingo became not just a business but a massive, sprawling opportunity for theft and fraud. The original budget Wilkerson had imagined something under $1 million was soon shattered. With Siegel in charge, costs ballooned to several times that figure. Invoices came in for steel and concrete at inflated prices. Subcontractors loyal to him or to his allies overcharged for work or were paid for work never completed. Materials went missing, or cheap substitutes were installed while invoices reflected top-of-the-line goods. Labor costs swelled, partly from legitimate wage increases and partly because payrolls carried ghost workers whose salaries were skimmed. From the viewpoint of a neutral accountant, the Flamingo project looked like a textbook example of mismanagement tangled with deliberate fraud. From the viewpoint of the syndicate bosses bankrolling it, it looked like a black hole. They were sending money out of New York and Chicago only to see endless requests for more. Each time, Siegel had an explanation. The desert climate required more robust construction. The DC ore had to be first class to draw high rollers. The war had caused shortages, driving up prices. The project was too far along to cut corners now. Meanwhile, people around him whispered that he and his companion, Virginia Hill, were not just spending mob money on marble and carpets. They were allegedly siphoning off serious sums, sending them through a chain of accounts into hidden bank deposits, some said in Switzerland. Hill, who had worked as a courier and go-between for various mob figures before becoming Siegel's lover, knew the routes, the names, and the tricks. She traveled frequently, sometimes with no clear explanation for where she had gone or why. Law enforcement and underworld rumor joined hands in suspecting that those trips were part of a grand theft. Flamingo money vanishing into foreign vaults. To understand why this enraged Siegel's partner so deeply, you have to remember how the syndicate saw itself. Yes, it was criminal. It stole, extorted, smuggled, murdered. But within its own operations, it prized discipline and profit above all. Money that flowed into the pot was meant to be reinvested, distributed, used to grease politicians or expand businesses. Stealing from the organization skimming was a taboo far more serious than simply robbing some outsider. It was, in their internal code, a kind of treason. In meetings in Havana and other quiet havens, as the war ended and travel became easier, Lansky and other key figures sat in hotel suites and discussed the Flamingo. Accountants laid out figures. Where they had expected perhaps $1 million or so in total cost, they now saw numbers climbing past $4 million, then $6 million. Siegel, when present, responded with charm and anger. This was his project. It needed to be done right. Once it was finished, the money would pour in. He insisted that many of the worst rumors were lies spread by his enemies. It was true that he lived well, he would concede, but he had always lived well. That didn't mean he was stealing. Some of the older, more conservative bosses were not impressed. They had not come up through gambling and Hollywood. They had built their power in the rackets, on the docks, in the numbers business in poor neighborhoods. To them, Siegel looked dangerously like a man seduced by his own image. He wore perfect suits, took the best tables in restaurants, slept with actresses and threw money around like a movie star. It was one thing to do that with your own earnings. It was another to do it with money entrusted to you for investment. They demanded results, not just parties and photographs. Lansky, tied to Siegel by years of friendship and shared history, found himself in an increasingly painful position. On the one hand, he could see the Flamingo's potential. If the resort opened successfully and became profitable, the initial overrun, even if it included theft, might be forgiven in the wave of cash that followed. On the other hand, he also heard the boss's grievances loud and clear. Every dollar Siegel spent, or stole, was a dollar they had expected to see come back multiplied. Lansky had a reputation for being cool and ruthless when business required it. But here, for perhaps the only time in his career, he tried to stall the inevitable. He argued that they should wait until the Flamingo opened, watch the numbers, and then decide. It was a delay, not a pardon, but it gave Siegel a little more time. During these desert years, Siegel's list of crimes continued to expand. Beyond the massive financial fraud tied to the Flamingo construction, he remained entangled in various violent intrigues. The earlier murder of Harry Big Greenie Greenberg, an associate killed in front of his Los Angeles home in 1939, still lay in the background like a shadow. Greenberg had allegedly threatened to turn informant, to tell authorities what he knew about the syndicate's operations and Siegel's role. For that, killers had been dispatched. Shots in the night had ended his life. Though the Greenberg murder had occurred years before the Flamingo drama, its legal consequences unfolded in the same period when Siegel most needed stability. In the mid-1940s, prosecutors in California finally brought him to trial for the killing. The case was sensational. Newspapers ran headlines. Here, at last, was the state's chance to put Bugsy behind bars. Witnesses, including former mob associate Abe Kid Twist Reilly's before his own mysterious death, had named Siegel among the conspirators. In court, the old pattern repeated itself. Defense attorneys attacked the credibility of witnesses, pointing out their criminal backgrounds and their obvious motives to trade testimony for leniency. Witnesses who had once seemed eager to talk suddenly became hesitant on the stand, claimed not to remember, or contradicted themselves. Jurors sensed the invisible hands of intimidation pressing on the case, even if they never saw the men behind those hands. In the end, the trial did not produce a conviction. Siegel walked out of the courtroom a free man again, but the process came at a cost. Legal fees, disrupted business, public stress, and, crucially, a further erosion of trust among some of his old allies. To those allies, the Greenberg case reinforced two things. First, that Siegel was perpetually surrounded by trouble, and second, that his way of handling problems often created more heat than it solved. Law enforcement attention followed him. Headlines followed him. For a syndicate that preferred to operate in the shadows, this was dangerous. Back in Las Vegas, between court appearances and strategy meetings, construction on the Flamingo finally limped towards something that resembled completion. Siegel insisted on high standards in the visible parts of the resort: the lobby, the casino, the pool area. He wanted polished floors, stylish furniture, good-looking staff. He ordered changes to the design of the gardens, demanded better furnishings for the suites, and spent generously on details outsiders could barely see. Some of this reflected a genuine sense of style. Some of it may also have been a way to justify ever-rising costs. As the projected opening date approached, the tension around him grew almost tangible. He needed the Flamingo to be a success, and quickly. Not just for his ego, but for his survival. If he could show strong profits, he could argue that all the earlier chaos had been part of a necessary, if messy, birth. If the opening failed, if the resort hemorrhaged money, then his enemies inside the syndicate would have a powerful argument that he had become more trouble than he was worth. December 26, 1946, was chosen for the grand opening. The timing, in the lull between Christmas and New Year, was supposed to attract wealthy visitors from Los Angeles and beyond, people looking to spend the holidays in a new kind of playground. Press releases went out. Invitations circulated among Hollywood circles. Bands were booked, dealers trained, champagne ordered. Siegel, always theatrical, imagined a night that would announce the Flamingo and himself to the world. Reality, as so often happened in his life, refused to cooperate. The weather turned bad. A winter rainstorm rolled over the desert, turning the grounds muddy and muting the neon's glow. Inside, not everything was ready. Construction delays, supply problems and mismanagement meant that many hotel rooms were incomplete. Guests encountered wet paint, bare wiring, missing fixtures. The casino itself opened, but the resort did not look like the smooth dream that had been sold in advance. Some Hollywood stars did make the trip. They walked through the casino in tailored suits and glamorous dresses, smiled for photographers, scattered chips on green felt. But many were unimpressed by the disorganization and left quickly, returning to Los Angeles to gossip about the desert circus that had overpromised and underdelivered. On the floor, the tables saw initial bursts of action, but the crowds were not as large or as steady as they needed to be to cover the massive costs hanging over the building like a storm cloud. The opening weeks were financially disastrous. The Flamingo lost thousands upon thousands of dollars, hemorrhaging cash faster than new bets could replace it. Siegel, watching the numbers, must have felt the walls close in. He responded by throwing more money and energy at the problem. The hotel portion of the resort, still incomplete at the opening, was shut down temporarily for more work. The Flamingo closed for a period, then staged a soft reopening in early 1947, this time with more of the rooms ready, the staff better trained, the operations a little smoother. Business improved. The casino began to draw more consistent play, and the overall look of the resort finally matched, in part, the glamorous image Siegel had imagined. But from the perspective of the syndicate accountants, the partial recovery came too late and too slowly. Months of bad numbers, coming on top of years of overspending and suspected theft, had already tipped the internal balance against him. The same men whose money he had been spending now sat in meetings in Havana, Miami, and New York, looking at ledgers and asking the same question in different ways. Is he robbing us? And if he is, what are we going to do about it? Different factions within the syndicate took different stances. Some, especially those with less personal history with Siegel, argued that the case was simple. He had lost their money, he had stolen from them, and he should be removed, permanently. Others, with Lansky among them, argued that killing Siegel would send a dangerous message to ambitious lieutenants everywhere. That even the most loyal servants could be thrown aside the moment they stumbled. They suggested other options. Taking control of the Flamingo away from him, sidelining him, forcing him out of operations. But the old underworld logic, honed over decades of betrayals and bloody lessons, pushed in a familiar direction. A man who had shown he could casually murder others on orders could not be allowed to walk free once he himself was viewed as untrustworthy. In the meantime, Siegel continued his double life. In public, he played the role of the Flamingo's glamorous boss, shaking hands with guests, ordering staff around, handling minor issues with a mix of charm and threat. In private, he argued endlessly with partners, tried to track down where all the money had gone, sent angry messages to contractors, and perhaps, in quieter moments, felt the first cold fingers of fear. He had built a career on the assumption that he could manage any crisis with a mix of charisma, intimidation, and violence. But this crisis was different. The men angry with him now were not small-time rivals or timid business owners. They were the ones who decided, often quietly and far away, who lived and who died inside the syndicate. He sought reassurances where he could. Lansky reportedly told him at various points that things could still be worked out, that as long as the Flamingo started turning a profit and he cut out any skimming, there might be a path forward. Whether Lansky truly believed that, or was simply trying to calm a man he knew was dangerous when cornered, is difficult to say. But to Siegel, each reassurance would have sounded like a lifeline. If he could just get through the next month, the next quarter, maybe the tide would turn. It did not. Instead, as 1947 moved on, quiet decisions were made in rooms where he was not present. The exact details who spoke, who nodded, who delivered the final word remain hidden behind half-truths and coded recollections. But the outcome is, in retrospect, as clear as any death sentence written in ink. The Flamingo, no matter how profitable it might eventually become, would no longer be his. And Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the boy from Brooklyn who had climbed the underworld ladder with a pistol in his hand and a smile on his face, had reached the end of his credit. By early summer, he was spending much of his time not in Las Vegas but in California again, staying in Beverly Hills, moving in circles where the people around him still did not fully grasp how much danger he was in. To many of those Hollywood acquaintances, he was still the same figure. A slightly mysterious man with a violent past, yes, but also a generous friend who could pick up a check, tell a good story, and make them feel protected. Underneath that surface, however, the ground had shifted. On both coasts, men who had once shaken his hand now spoke of him in the past tense, as if he were already gone. In Las Vegas, his own associates began to prepare for a future in which the Flamingo would operate under new management. Mo Sedway and Gus Greenbaum, men with calmer temperaments and less appetite for theatrical violence, were being lined up for expanded roles. The machine Siegel had worked so hard to assemble would continue spinning. Without him, the casino would keep dealing cards, the cash would keep flowing. In the calculus of the syndicate, that was the whole point. No one man, no matter how colorful, was supposed to be indispensable. All of this brings us to the final stretch of Benjamin Siegel's story, the last sequence of events that transformed decades of crime, betrayal, and ambition into a few seconds of gunfire on a quiet residential street. In the next block, we will go step by step through those last days. His movements, his conversations, the position of the rifle barrel outside the window on Linden Drive, the way his body fell when the glass shattered, and the aftermath, the rush to claim his unfinished empire, the theories about who ordered his death, and the legacy of violence and money he left behind in both Las Vegas and Los Angeles. On the evening of June 20th, 1947, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel moved through his day like a man who still believed he had time left. There was no recorded sign that he suspected he was living his final hours. He had survived so many dangers already: street wars in Brooklyn, mafia power struggles in New York, murder investigations in Los Angeles, internal anger over Flamingo money, that part of him may have believed he was protected by some invisible shield of luck and instinct. He had been arrested, indicted, whispered about in newspapers and pointed at by terrified witnesses, and every time he had walked away. In the twisted logic of his world, he could almost convince himself that if anyone else were going to die for what had gone wrong in Las Vegas, it would be some anonymous underling, not him. The house he was staying in at 810 North Linden Drive in Beverly Hills was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that rich neighborhoods specialize in. It was a pleasant property, with a Spanish-style look, a tidy yard, and a sense of privacy that suited the woman whose name was on the paperwork. Virginia Hill, the red-haired queen of the underworld, as newspapers liked to call her, was not home. She had traveled to Europe weeks earlier, one of several long trips she made during this period. Whether those trips were purely personal or partly designed to move money and messages for the syndicate remains an open question, but her absence on that particular night would fuel speculation for decades. Some would argue she had been warned to be out of the way when the hammer finally fell on Siegel. She always denied this. Siegel spent the day bouncing between small errands and social meetings. He visited friends, made phone calls, talked about business. There were still ongoing issues with the Flamingo. Even though the casino's numbers had stabilized and were beginning to look promising, He was constantly dealing with operational problems and rivalries. He told some associates that everything would be fine, that the hotel was going to be the biggest thing in the desert, that all the sniping behind his back would eventually disappear once the profits stacked up. Whether he truly believed this or was simply trying to convince himself is impossible to know. He had dinner that evening at the Linden Drive house with several people, including his friend Alan Smiley, a gambler and associate who had been around him for years. They ate, they talked, they joked. If anyone in the room suspected that death was approaching, they did not show it. Siegel may have felt some tension. He always did, always scanning for threats, always aware of how many enemies he had. But there was no sign of panic or of a man trying to run. He was where he had been so many times before, at the top of a dangerous world, telling himself he could handle whatever came next. What came next was not a negotiation or a confrontation. It was not one more meeting with disgruntled partners or a sudden argument in a smoky back room. It was something far simpler and far more final. A man with a rifle outside a window. At around 10:45 p.m., Siegel settled into a chair or a sofa in the living room, near a large side window that looked out on the yard. The room was comfortable but not ostentatious. There were lamps, furniture, framed pictures on the walls. He took off his jacket, loosened his tie for comfort, and opened the Los Angeles Times. Smiley relaxed nearby in another chair, perhaps thinking about the day's events or about a game he might play tomorrow. To any stranger walking past outside, the scene inside would have looked ordinary. Two men finishing an evening in a middle-class living room, one reading the paper, the other unwinding. Somewhere in the darkness outside, among the shadows cast by hedges and trees, a figure was moving into position. The shooter had chosen his approach with care. In this kind of job, there is no room for improvisation. The window offered a clear line of sight to the spot where Siegel often sat a day. The distance was not great, but close enough to ensure accuracy. The weapon, according to later ballistics evidence, was likely an M1 carbine or a similar .30 caliber semi-automatic rifle, a military-style weapon that could fire quickly and with enough power to punch through glass, plaster, and bone with ease. The killer positioned the rifle, aligning the sights on the silhouette behind the glass. It is not clear how long he waited, how many seconds he spent looking at Siegel's relaxed posture through the window. All we know is that, at a certain moment, he began to fire. The quiet of Linden Drive was shattered by a rapid series of shots. Some accounts say 9 rounds were fired, others suggest as many as a dozen. As the bullets smashed through the glass, the window exploded inward, sending shards across the room. One bullet struck Siegel in the head, destroying his right eye and tearing through the base of his skull. Another hit his cheek, others struck his torso. The impact threw his body violently backward. The newspaper flew from his hands. He was dead almost instantly. Smiley, in pure animal reflex, dropped to the floor, miraculously untouched by the hail of lead that had just killed the man sitting only a few feet away. Neighbors, startled by the gunfire, called the police. Patrol cars and an ambulance raced toward the address, red lights flashing across the neat lawns and parked cars of Beverly Hills. Inside the living room, officers found a scene that would be described and redescribed in newspapers across America. Shattered glass, overturned furniture, and, on the floor or slumped on the couch, the body of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, his face disfigured by the devastating head wound. One of his eyes had been blown out of its socket by the bullet, an image that tabloid photographers rushed to capture and editors eagerly plastered on front pages the next morning, often without much respect for the dead. The crime scene report listed the wounds in clinical detail. Entry and exit points, trajectories, blood patterns. Shell casings were found outside the window, in the dark yard, marking where the shooter had stood. But the man who had placed them there was long gone. He had melted back into the night, likely climbing into a waiting car and being driven away by an accomplice on a route chosen in advance to avoid police. Within minutes, Benjamin Siegel was no longer a living player in the game. He was just another bullet-torn body in a police photograph, joining the long procession of victims whose deaths he had once helped arrange. News of the killing spread with astonishing speed. In an era before social media, the telephone and the wire services were enough to send the story from Los Angeles to New York, Chicago, Miami, and Las Vegas in what felt like an instant. Reporters poured into Beverly Hills. Neighbors clustered on sidewalks, craning for look. Some claimed they had always known something like this would happen. A man like that doesn't just die in his sleep, they told journalists. Others were shocked, having thought of Siegel as nothing more than a colorful neighbor with nice cars and glamorous guests. Within hours, Speculation about motives and suspects filled newsrooms and police stations. Officially, the case was open. Detectives dutifully collected statements, interviewed Smiley, traced Siegel's movements in the days and weeks before his death, and looked for forensic clues. Unofficially, many in law enforcement believed they already knew what had happened in broad outline. The syndicate had decided to solve a problem in the only way it truly trusted. At almost the same moment as the shots on Linden Drive rang out, a quieter shift was taking place hundreds of miles away in Las Vegas. There, at the Flamingo, men who had been operating under Siegel's name and authority found themselves suddenly answering to different people. Mo Sedway, a longtime associate of Lansky and the syndicate, stepped forward as the new on-site boss. Gus Greenbaum, another trusted operator, moved into a controlling role. There was no hesitation, no struggle for power. Control of the Flamingo transferred as smoothly as if the papers had been signed in a lawyer's office rather than in silent handshakes in back rooms. The message was unmistakable for anyone who understood how the syndicate worked. Siegel's death was not a random act of revenge or a heat-of-the-moment shooting. It was the final step in a carefully arranged transition. Theories about who ordered and carried out the killing sprang up instantly and have never fully gone away. One strong line of suspicion targeted the national leadership of the syndicate. In this version, the bosses had simply run out of patience. The Flamingo's cost overruns, the evidence of skimming, and the endless stream of excuses had convinced them that Siegel could no longer be trusted. Friendship, history, and charm were weighed against the missing millions and the risk that a desperate or cornered Siegel might someday talk to authorities. The scales tipped toward elimination. Meyer Lansky's role, in this narrative, is tragic and ambiguous. Some accounts suggest he argued bitterly against killing Siegel and only gave in when it became clear he was outvoted. Others say he knew the decision had been made and chose not to fight it, preferring to protect his own position and the syndicate's broader interests. There is even a version, less widely accepted, that casts Lansky as quietly resigned, understanding that the rules they had all lived by since their youth in Brooklyn left no room for special treatment. Whatever the truth, we know this. Lansky did not publicly avenge Siegel, did not declare war on the men who took his childhood friend's life, and continued to work within the very structure that had decided Bugsy's fate. Another theory points to Jack Dragna, the Italian-American boss of the Los Angeles Mafia. Dragna had long resented Siegel's presence and power in what he saw as his territory. While East Coast bosses had imposed Siegel on the West as their representative, Dragna had to swallow the fact that an outsider and a Jewish gangster at that was commanding operations that he believed should fall under his direct control. According to this line of thought, Dragna either lobbied for permission to remove Siegel or quietly cooperated with those already planning the hit, offering local manpower, intelligence, or logistical support. Beyond these, dozens of minor variations exist. Some name rival gambling interests, angry businessmen, or even personal enemies as possible drivers of the plot. But when you strip away the extraneous theories and focus on the known pattern of syndicate justice, the simplest explanation remains the most convincing. The same system that had rewarded Benjamin Siegel for decades of violence and loyalty decided, when he became too expensive and too unpredictable, to close his file with a burst of rifle fire. The official police investigation, for all its effort, never produced an arrest. No one was charged, tried, or convicted for the killing of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. The case joined the long list of high-profile American murders where everyone knows who is responsible in a general sense, but no one can point to a single man and say, with legal certainty, he pulled the trigger, or he gave the order. In that sense, the murder was a perfect reflection of the world Siegel had inhabited. A world where real decisions were hidden behind layers of silence and deniability, and where bodies on sidewalks were considered messages, not mysteries. In the days after the killing, attention turned briefly to Virginia Hill. Reporters chased her in Europe, asking whether she had known about the plot, whether she had helped set Siegel up by leaving town and letting him relax in what he thought was a safe house. She denied any involvement, insisting she had loved him and was devastated by his death. Law enforcement looked into her finances, her trips, her connections, and, more broadly, the flows of money that had moved between her accounts and those of men in the syndicate. They suspected she had helped conceal stolen Flamingo funds. But suspicion is not proof. Like so many figures orbiting the periphery of organized crime, she slipped away from formal justice, carrying her own secrets to the grave. Back in Las Vegas, the Flamingo went on. Past the headlines and the gossip, dealers still snapped cards onto felt roulette balls still clattered into numbered slot machines still swallowed coins and spat out winnings or disappointments. Under Sedway and Greenbaum, the casino's operations grew more efficient. The illegal skimming may have been better organized or at least more carefully hidden. Over time, the Flamingo became profitable, very profitable. As other resorts rose along the highway, the stretch of road that would become the Las Vegas Strip turned into the glittering, neon-soaked symbol of gambling that early dreamers had imagined. If you stand in Las Vegas today, staring up at hotel towers, watching tourists shuffle along casino floors under artificial sky ceilings and LED light shows, you are seeing the distant echo of Siegel's dream. But you are also seeing something he never fully understood. In the world he helped build, individuals were just pieces. The machine is what mattered. As soon as he was removed, other hands grabbed the controls. The money he envisioned did flow, just not into his own pockets. For the families of those Siegel had harmed over the years, there was little consolation in the clean efficiency of his death. The small Jewish pushcart owners he had extorted in Brooklyn, the bootlegging rivals he had ambushed, the unnamed victims of Murder Inc. Hits he helped plan or execute, the gamblers he cheated, the business owners he shook down in Los Angeles, the relatives of Harry Greenberg, who died in front of his house under a rain of bullets. None of them got to see him answer for his crimes in a courtroom. His punishment came not as the result of their grief or the state's justice, but as a bookkeeping decision made by men who shared his values and his ruthlessness. From a documentary perspective, if we try to count his crimes, the list grows long. Early in his career, there were the street-level extortions. Protection money taken from vendors under threat of arson or assault. Then came hijackings of liquor trucks and enforcement killings during Prohibition. In the early 1930s, he was deeply involved in the underworld power shifts, allegedly participating in the murders of Joe Masria and Salvatore Maranzano, which reshaped the Mafia's leadership. As part of Murder Inc., he helped implement the syndicate's nationwide policy of murder as a management tool, which meant that any criminal who broke the rules risked a bullet from men like him. Later, in California, his crimes painted over more polished surfaces but remained just as real. Extorting bookmakers, forcing nightclub owners into partnerships, using violence to control the race wire, taking cuts from gambling ships, overseeing union manipulation and industrial shakedowns. He was linked by informants and investigators to narcotics trafficking, adding the human destruction caused by heroin and other drugs to his ledger. The Greenberg murder alone stands as a clear example of how he dealt with perceived betrayal. A one-time friend or associate, now seen as a loose end, reduced to a body on the pavement. Then, on top of all that, there was the Flamingo, his masterpiece and his doom. There, the crime moved into white-collar territory. Massive financial fraud, embezzlement, skimming from investors who themselves were criminals. Even if we set aside the underworld's internal ethics and look with neutral eyes, the pattern is clear. He took money entrusted to him for business development and diverted it for personal use. In any legitimate corporation, such behavior would have brought charges of fraud and theft. In the syndicate, the verdict was delivered through gunfire instead of judges. Despite this record, or perhaps because of it, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel's image in popular culture has often been softened and romanticized. Films cast handsome actors in a role, dressing them in perfect suits, surrounding them with soft lighting and tragic music. They emphasize his charm, his ambition, his vision for Las Vegas. They show him as a man torn between old-school criminal methods and a desire to build something enduring and beautiful. To a point, those portrayals are not entirely false. He did have natural charisma. He did see the potential for a new kind of resort in the desert. He did move among the glamorous and the powerful with a confidence that impressed those who had never seen the bloody side of his career. But a strictly documentary look cannot stop at that. It has to hold both images together. The man in the tuxedo raising a glass in a posh casino lounge, and the same man years earlier, standing in a dark doorway with a gun, waiting for a target to come home. The polished shoes on the casino floor and the muddy footprints in some anonymous alley after a murder. The smiles in Hollywood photographs and the cold, flat expression witnesses described when he pulled the trigger. In the end, what was left of Benjamin Siegel? On Linden Drive, when the sirens stopped and the photographers packed up and the blood was scrubbed from the floor, the house returned to being just another Beverly Hills property. Someone else lived there, then someone else, as the years passed. In Las Vegas, the Flamingo went through countless renovations, expansions, demolitions, and rebuilds. The original buildings he had obsessed over were, in time, replaced or buried under new structures. Tourists walk through lobbies and casinos without any idea of how many threats, bribes, and gunshots had gone into making their vacation possible. In police archives and FBI files, his name sits on yellowing pages, attached to lists of unsolved murders, suspected rackets, phone transcripts, and surveillance reports. In underworld legend, he is remembered both as a pioneer and as a cautionary tale, the golden boy who believed he was special enough to steal from his own and get away with it, and who discovered too late that no one is truly special in a system that treats loyalty as a temporary commodity. For us, looking back with the distance of time, his story is a lens. Through it, we can see how American organized crime evolved in the 20th century. How it moved from street corners into boardrooms, from back alleys into resort lobbies, how it turned murder into a routine business decision, how it learned to wear a tie and smile for cameras while still communicating in the same old language of fear. Siegel's life and death mark a turning point in that evolution, from the raw Prohibition-era gang wars to the more polished, corporate-style mob of the post-war years. If you have stayed with this story through all 3 blocks, you now have something more than the movie version myth of Bugsy, the glamorous gangster who built Las Vegas. You have walked through the crowded tenements of Brooklyn, where he learned extortion as a teenager through the blood-soaked years of Murder, Inc. When he helped enforce the syndicate's rules with bullets through the smoky clubs and back rooms of Hollywood, where he blended crime and show business through the construction trenches of the Flamingo, where mob money turned into concrete and missing dollars, and finally into that living room in Beverly Hills where a series of shots turned one more gangster into one more corpse. If you want more long, detailed documentary stories like this about Al Capone, John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, Pretty Boy Floyd, Machine Gun Kelly, and other figures whose legend hide long trails of real crimes, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and that you've turned on the notification bell. In the description, you'll find a link to our Telegram channel, where we post extra photographs, crime scene images and archival documents that we can't always show here. Leave a comment telling us which story you want to hear next. Share this video with someone who only knows the name Bugsy Siegel from the movies, and remember, behind every glamorous legend in organized crime, there is always a ledger of violence that somebody had to pay for in blood.